I thought inviting my nephew to stay over would bring us closer as family. But what happened that night shattered every boundary and changed my life forever. His arrival seemed ordinary, but the way he looked at me, it was anything but. By the time I realized what was unfolding, it was too late to turn back. We were a close-knit family, or so I thought. I had always seen myself as the dependable aunt, someone my nephew could rely on. Life had been uneventful lately, work consumed most of my time, and evenings were spent in quiet solitude. My husband, who was always busy traveling for work, left me to manage the house alone. I had grown accustomed to the silence, but sometimes it felt deafening. Luke, my nephew, was a bright, reserved young man. At 20, he was navigating college life with all its challenges. He had always been the shy one in family gatherings, standing on the periphery while others took center stage. But there was something about his quiet demeanor that drew people in, a subtle charm wrapped in sincerity. When he reached out asking if he could stay with me for a few weeks, I was thrilled. It had been years since we spent meaningful time together, and I thought it would be refreshing to have someone around to break the monotony. I spent the days before his arrival preparing his room, dusting off old memories, and cooking dishes I thought he might enjoy. The day he arrived, the house felt different. His knock on the door startled me out of my thoughts, and when I opened it, I was taken aback. Luke wasn't the lanky teenager I remembered. He had grown into a confident, striking young man. His broad shoulders and easy smile caught me off guard. "Hey, Aunt Ellie," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. I welcomed him warmly, but something about his presence stirred an unfamiliar nervousness in me. That evening, over dinner, we talked like old friends. He shared stories about college life, his struggles, and the dreams he was chasing. I listened, laughing at his humor and marveling at his maturity. He had a way of making me feel seen, like his words were meant to lift some invisible weight off my shoulders. As I cleared the dishes that night, I caught myself thinking about the way he smiled at me during dinner. It was warm, kind, and something else I couldn't quite place. Shaking off the thought, I convinced myself it was nothing. He was family, after all. Nothing more. The first few days of Luke's stay passed uneventfully, but something subtle began to shift. It started with little things: a lingering glance, a soft smile, the way his eyes seemed to hold mine a second longer than necessary. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Luke had always been affectionate, and I chalked it up to him feeling comfortable around me. But as the days wore on, I couldn't ignore the growing tension. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Luke wandered in. He dropped onto the couch with an easy grace, his legs stretched out in front of him. "Need help with that?" he asked, gesturing toward the pile of clothes. "No, I've got it," I replied, but he reached over and grabbed a towel anyway, folding it neatly. His hands were steady, his movements deliberate, and I found myself watching him longer than I should have. When he caught my gaze, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. The nights seemed to heighten everything. After dinner, we'd sit together in the living room, a movie playing in the background. Luke always sat closer than I expected, his arm occasionally brushing against mine. Once, I glanced over to find him watching me instead of the screen. "What?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Nothing," he said, his grin playful but laced with something deeper. "You just look happy." His words sent a wave of confusion through me. Was he being kind, or was there something more to it? I laughed it off, but the warmth in his tone lingered in my mind long after the movie ended. Then there was his phone, a constant companion that he seemed suddenly protective of. I noticed him texting late at night, his screen lighting up his face in the darkness. When I teased him about it, he shrugged and said it was just a friend. But the way he avoided eye contact made me wonder. One afternoon, I caught him staring out the window, lost in thought. "You okay?" I asked, handing him a cup of coffee. He took it with a smile but didn't answer right away. "Finally," he said, "it's just nice to be here. It feels like home." His words struck a chord I didn't want to acknowledge. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced. I replayed every look, every word, every touch. There was a weight in the air between us, something unspoken but undeniably present. I told myself it was just my imagination, a byproduct of spending too much time alone. But deep down, I knew better. As the days passed, Luke began to find reasons to be near me. Whether it was helping in the kitchen, fixing something around the house, or simply sitting beside me while I worked, his presence became a constant. And with it came the growing awareness that something wasn't right. One evening, as we were washing dishes, his hand brushed against mine under the running water. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled back, pretending to focus on the plate I was scrubbing. "You don't have to help, you know," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "I want to," he replied, his voice soft. "You've been taking care of me all week. Let me return the favor." It was an innocent statement, but the way he said it, quiet and sincere, made my breath catch. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered on me longer than it should have. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building between us. A storm, gathering strength, waiting to break. As the days passed, life settled into a comfortable rhythm with Luke around. The house was livelier, the quiet corners filled with laughter and conversation. He helped with chores without being asked and shared stories about his college life that made me nostalgic for my own youth. Yet, something felt different, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. It began with the little things. Luke's gaze seemed to linger longer than usual when we talked, his hazel eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my stomach flutter. I convinced myself it was my imagination, a projection of my loneliness. But the feeling persisted. One evening, I noticed him scrolling through his phone while sitting on the couch. His laughter filled the room as he showed me a funny meme. When I leaned in to see the screen, our shoulders brushed. It was a casual moment, yet I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. "You okay, Aunt Ellie?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded quickly, brushing off the moment. "Just tired," I replied. But the truth was, I wasn't tired, I was confused. Luke began spending more time in my company, opting to stay in rather than explore the city. "You make this place feel like home," he said one evening, his voice soft. His words caught me off guard, and I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Well, it is your second home," I replied, trying to keep things light. But the weight of his words lingered. Then came the late-night chats. After the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, we would sit in the living room, talking about everything and nothing. One night, as I sipped on a glass of wine, Luke leaned back on the couch, his arm draped casually over the backrest. "You seem different, Aunt Ellie," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Happier. More alive." His comment left me speechless. How could I explain that his presence had brought a light into my life that I hadn't realized was missing? The turning point came one rainy afternoon. We were sorting through old photo albums, laughing at pictures of family vacations and embarrassing childhood moments. As I handed him a particularly cringe-worthy photo of himself in braces, our fingers brushed. He didn't pull away immediately, and neither did I. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I quickly withdrew my hand, hoping he didn't notice the slight tremor. Later that evening, I couldn't shake the memory of that fleeting touch. I found myself analyzing every interaction, questioning whether I was reading too much into his actions. But Luke's behavior only deepened my uncertainty. He began complimenting me more frequently on my cooking, my outfit, even the way I laughed. "You have the kind of laugh that makes other people smile," he said one evening, his voice warm. My heart raced at his words, but I quickly reminded myself of the boundaries that existed between us. Despite my efforts to rationalize everything, a sense of unease crept into my thoughts. The way Luke looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name, it all felt too intimate. I tried to dismiss the feelings, blaming them on my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the questions swirled in my mind. Was I misinterpreting his kindness? Or was there something unspoken, something neither of us dared to acknowledge? My heart told me one thing, but my mind screamed another. I couldn't shake the feeling that Luke wasn't just my nephew anymore. He had become something else entirely, a presence I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. The tension between us grew like an unspoken secret, simmering beneath the surface of every interaction. Days turned into nights, and the invisible line we had once stood firmly behind began to blur. It was a Saturday evening when the atmosphere shifted again. Rain tapped gently against the windows, creating a cozy backdrop as we lounged on the couch. Luke had suggested watching a movie, and I agreed, hoping the distraction would ease the inexplicable tension that had been lingering between us. He sat closer than before. His leg brushed mine as he reached for the remote, and though I tried to ignore it, the warmth of the contact sent a spark through me. The movie played on, but my focus was elsewhere. I was hyper-aware of his presence, the way his arm rested casually along the back of the couch, just inches from my shoulder. "You're quiet," he said suddenly, his voice soft but curious. "Something on your mind?" I shook my head, offering a faint smile. "No, just enjoying the movie," I lied. He didn't press further, but his gaze lingered, making my pulse quicken. Halfway through the film, he shifted, turning slightly toward me. "I'm glad I came here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels good to be with someone who actually listens, who cares." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I turned to face him. "You're always welcome here, Luke. You know that." My voice trembled slightly, betraying the whirlwind of emotions swirling within me. Our eyes locked for a moment too long, the air between us heavy with something unspoken. I broke the gaze, turning back to the screen, but I could feel his eyes on me. The moment passed, but the weight of it stayed. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a quiet longing that mirrored my own confusion. I chastised myself for entertaining the thought. He was my nephew, and these feelings were wrong, weren't they? The next day, Luke suggested we cook dinner together. "It'll be fun," he said with a grin that made it impossible to say no. We moved around the kitchen in a rhythm that felt natural, our movements synchronized as if we had done this 100 times before. At one point, as I reached for a pan, his hand brushed mine. The touch lingered longer than necessary, and when I looked up, his hazel eyes were fixed on mine. "Sorry," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that belied the casualness of the moment. "It's fine," I replied, quickly turning back to the stove. But my heart was racing, and I couldn't ignore the electricity that had passed between us. As the evening wore on, the boundaries continued to dissolve. After dinner, we found ourselves back on the couch, a glass of wine in hand. The conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by laughter and quiet moments of reflection. At one point, Luke reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was so intimate, so natural, that it took my breath away. "You're amazing, you know that," he said, his voice low. "You don't give yourself enough credit." I tried to laugh it off, but the sincerity in his tone stopped me. "Thank you, Luke," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That means a lot." The next few days were a whirlwind of stolen glances and fleeting touches. The tension between us was undeniable, and yet neither of us dared to address it. One night, as we sat in the dim light of the living room, Luke leaned closer, his arm brushing against mine. "You make me feel like I can be myself," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Like I don't have to pretend." I didn't know how to respond. My mind screamed at me to create distance, to draw a line in the sand, but my heart betrayed me. "You're easy to be around," I said finally, my voice unsteady. "You make this house feel alive again." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Luke reached out and took my hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and yet it set my entire body alight. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of vulnerability. "I don't know how to explain this, but being here with you feels right." I looked at him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and longing. "Luke, we can't," I said, my voice trembling. But even as the words left my lips, I didn't pull my hand away. "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this." The honesty in his words broke something inside me, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. We have to be careful, I said, my voice shaking. We can't let this get out of hand. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. I don't want to hurt you. I needed you to know how I feel. The moment stretched into eternity, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the feelings I had been suppressing. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and entirely overwhelming. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, confusion, guilt, and a strange, undeniable pull toward Luke. Every interaction felt charged, as if the weight of unspoken truths hung in the air between us. I tried to maintain normalcy, to convince myself that whatever I was feeling would fade, but deep down, I knew the line had already been crossed. The breaking point came on a quiet Friday evening. The house was still, the hum of the ceiling fan the only sound as we sat together in the living room. Luke had insisted on making dinner, a simple pasta dish that he proudly presented with a boyish grin. We laughed, we talked, and for a moment, it felt like everything was normal. But the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore. After dinner, Luke poured us both a glass of wine and suggested watching another movie. Something light, he said with a smile, scrolling through the options. I agreed, hoping the distraction would quiet the storm raging inside me. But as the movie played, I found myself unable to focus. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What was happening between us? How had we gotten here? It wasn't long before the distance between us on the couch disappeared. Luke shifted closer, his arm brushing against mine. My heart raced as I felt the warmth of his skin. You're tense, he said softly, glancing at me. Is everything okay? I forced a laugh, shaking my head. I'm fine. Just tired. But my voice betrayed me, trembling under the weight of my emotions. Luke didn't press further. Instead, he leaned back, his arm draping casually along the back of the couch. You know, he began, his voice low, being here with you. It's the first time in a long time I've felt like I belong somewhere. His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I turned to him, my breath catching as our eyes met. There was an honesty in his gaze, a vulnerability that left me speechless. Luke, I began, my voice trembling, this is complicated. I know, he said, cutting me off gently. But I can't ignore it anymore. I can't pretend I don't feel something when I'm with you. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, demanding a response I wasn't ready to give. Luke, I said finally, we can't do this. It's not right. Why? He asked, his voice firm but not angry. Because it's what people would say. Because it's what's expected. I don't care about any of that. I care about you. I stood, needing to put some distance between us. This isn't about what people would say, I replied, my voice rising. It's about what's right. And this isn't. He stood too, closing the space between us. But what if it is? He asked, his voice softer now. What if this is right, and we're too afraid to see it? I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. Luke, you don't understand. This would change everything. Maybe it should, he replied, his hazel eyes searching mine. Maybe everything needs to change. Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze, unable to pull away as he stepped closer. Ellie, he said softly, his voice trembling. Just tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll let it go. But if you do, please, don't push me away. The air between us was thick with tension, the unspoken feelings we had both been suppressing now laid bare. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and restore the boundaries that had been shattered. But as I looked into his eyes, I couldn't bring myself to lie. I do, I whispered, my voice breaking. But that doesn't make it right. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he closed the distance between us, his hand reaching up to cup my cheek. It doesn't have to be wrong, he said softly, his thumb brushing against my skin. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt the warmth of his touch. Every rational thought screamed at me to step away, to end this before it spiraled further out of control. But my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch as if it had a mind of its own. The first kiss was hesitant, a tentative meeting of lips that sent shockwaves through me. It was wrong, and yet it felt inevitable, as if every moment leading up to this had been building toward it. When we pulled away, our foreheads rested together, our breaths mingling in the stillness. "This is dangerous," I said softly, my voice trembling. "I don't care," he replied, his voice steady. "I've never felt this way before, and I don't want to lose it." That night, everything changed. The walls we had built to keep our feelings at bay crumbled, leaving us exposed and vulnerable. The connection between us deepened, transcending words and logic. It was raw, intense, and terrifying all at once. But as the hours stretched into dawn, the weight of what we had done began to sink in. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the reality of the situation crashed over me. What would happen now? How could we go back to the way things were? The next morning, Luke was quiet, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a thoughtful seriousness. Over coffee, he broke the silence. "We need to talk about last night," he said, his voice steady. I nodded, my chest tightening. "I know. I don't regret it," he continued, his hazel eyes locking onto mine. "But I need to know where we stand." The honesty in his voice was both comforting and devastating. "I don't regret it either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to be careful, Luke. Whatever this is, it can't just be about the moment. We have to think about what it means." He nodded, his expression serious. "I understand. I don't want to lose what we have." "You won't," I said firmly, though my voice betrayed my own uncertainty. "But we need to take this one step at a time." As the day unfolded, an unspoken agreement seemed to settle between us. We didn't know what the future held, but for now, we were willing to navigate it together, carefully, cautiously, and with the understanding that what we had was as fragile as it was powerful. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope. Luke and I tiptoed around the tension that now defined our relationship, careful not to let it spiral further. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. The lines we'd crossed, the emotions we'd unraveled, they clung to me like a shadow. Luke, too, seemed affected. He was quieter than usual, his easy laughter replaced by a reflective silence. At times, I would catch him watching me, his hazel eyes filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. It was clear he was waiting for me to take the lead, to define what this was or where it was going. But I didn't have the answers he needed, I barely had them for myself. One evening, as I was folding laundry, Luke entered the room. He hesitated in the doorway, his hand running nervously through his hair. "Ellie," he began softly, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "We need to talk." I placed the towel in my hands on the bed and turned to face him. "I know," I replied, my chest tightening. I had been dreading this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. "I can't keep pretending everything is normal," he said, stepping closer. "I know this isn't easy for you, it's not easy for me either. But I need to know where we stand." His words hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. How could I explain the turmoil in my heart? The way I felt pulled in two directions, one toward him, and the other toward the life I had built. "Luke," I said finally, my voice trembling, "what happened between us? It can't happen again." His face fell, and the pain in his expression made my chest ache. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because it's wrong. Or because you don't feel the same way." "It's not about how I feel," I replied, tears stinging my eyes. "This is bigger than us. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." "But what if the right thing doesn't feel right?" he countered, stepping closer. "What if what we have, is what's meant to be?" I shook my head, backing away slightly. "We can't think like that, Luke. It's dangerous, and it'll only hurt us both in the end." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room was suffocating, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on us. Finally, Luke broke the silence. "I can't stay here," he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "Not like this. I need space to figure out what I'm feeling, what I want." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew he was right. "Maybe that's for the best," I said softly, though the thought of him leaving made my chest tighten. "We both need time to think." The following morning, The house was eerily quiet as Luke packed his bags. I stood in the doorway of his room, watching as he folded his clothes with meticulous care. "When will I see you again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused, his hands resting on the bag in front of him. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'll call. I promise." As he loaded his bags into the car, I felt a lump form in my throat. He turned to face me one last time, his hazel eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Take care of yourself, Ellie," he said softly. "And don't forget, you're not alone." "I won't," I replied, tears spilling down my cheeks. "You take care too." The car pulled away, and I stood there, watching until it disappeared down the street. The ache in my chest was almost unbearable, but I knew this was what needed to happen. Luke was right, we needed space to figure out what we were feeling, to decide whether this was a momentary lapse in judgment or something more. The days that followed were some of the loneliest I had ever experienced. The house felt empty without him, the silence a stark reminder of what I had lost. I replayed our conversations in my mind, analyzing every word, every look, every touch. Had I made the right decision? Or had I let fear dictate my actions? Work became my refuge, a way to distract myself from the whirlwind of emotions. But even there, I found it hard to focus. My thoughts constantly drifted to Luke, his smile, his laugh, the way he made me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through old photos, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Luke. "I miss you." The simplicity of his words brought tears to my eyes. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as I debated how to respond. Finally, I typed a reply. "I miss you too." In that moment, I realized that no amount of distance could erase what had happened between us. The bond we shared was undeniable, and though I didn't know what the future held, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The fallout of our actions was far from over. There would be more difficult conversations, more moments of doubt and guilt. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to navigate this together. The days turned into weeks, and the ache in my chest began to dull, though it never disappeared entirely. Luke's absence was a constant reminder of the line we had crossed and the consequences that followed. Yet, his message, those 3 simple words, "I miss you," lingered in my mind, filling me with a mix of hope and uncertainty. I threw myself into work and routine, trying to reclaim the sense of normalcy that had been shattered. But even as I went through the motions, I couldn't help but replay the events in my mind. The nights we spent talking, the way he looked at me with such raw honesty, it had all felt so real, so undeniable. And yet, it was forbidden, tangled in complexities that couldn't be unraveled easily. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Luke. "Can we talk?" My fingers hovered over the screen, my heart racing. I knew that speaking to him would reopen wounds that were still healing, but the thought of shutting him out completely felt unbearable. After a moment of hesitation, I replied, "Yes. Call me." The phone rang minutes later, and as I answered, the sound of his voice brought an instant flood of emotions. "Hi," he said softly, his tone cautious. "How are you?" "I'm okay," I replied, though the tremor in my voice betrayed the truth. "How about you?" "I've been thinking about us," he admitted, his words coming slowly. "About everything that happened. And I need to know where we stand." His honesty was disarming, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "Luke, what happened between us, it was real. I can't deny that. But it's not something we can act on, not without consequences." "I know," he said quietly. "But that doesn't change how I feel about you. I've never felt this way before, Ellie. And I don't know how to let it go." The vulnerability in his voice broke my heart. "You don't have to let it go," I said softly. "But we need to be careful. We need to think about what's right for both of us, not just in the moment, but in the long run." For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable, filled with the weight of words unspoken. Finally, Luke broke it. "I want you to be happy," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Even if that means stepping back." Tears welled in my eyes at his selflessness. And I want the same for you, I replied. That's why we need to take time to figure this out separately. The call ended with a sense of bittersweet understanding. We both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but there was a quiet hope that time and distance might bring clarity. In the months that followed, I began to reflect deeply on what had happened. The connection Luke and I shared was undeniable, but it had emerged in a moment of vulnerability for both of us. I realized that part of what drew us together was the sense of comfort and understanding we provided for each other, a refuge from the loneliness we both felt. But as much as I cherished those moments, I knew that they came at a cost. Boundaries exist for a reason, and crossing them often leads to consequences far greater than we anticipate. The choices we make in moments of weakness can ripple outwards, affecting not just ourselves but the people around us. Through it all, one lesson stood out above the rest. Sometimes, love isn't about holding on, it's about letting go. It's about recognizing when something, no matter how powerful, isn't meant to be. And it's about having the strength to make the choices that protect not just ourselves, but the people we care about most. Luke and I stayed in touch, though our conversations became less frequent as time passed. He returned to college, throwing himself into his studies and rebuilding his life. I focused on rediscovering myself, finding joy in the little things and learning to navigate the quiet moments without letting them consume me. The bond we shared remained, but it evolved into something different, something that respected the boundaries we had so precariously danced around. And though I still thought of him often, I knew that letting go was the right choice. In the end, the experience taught me more about myself than I ever could have imagined. It reminded me of the importance of self-awareness, of understanding the motivations behind our actions and the consequences they can carry. Most of all, it reminded me that love, in all its forms, is as much about respect and restraint as it is about passion. As I sat in the quiet of my home one evening, a sense of peace washed over me. The path we had taken had been fraught with mistakes and pain, but it had also been a journey of growth and understanding. And for that, I would always be grateful. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Could you have walked away, or would you have followed your heart, no matter the cost? Share your thoughts in the comments below, I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more gripping stories, and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.